Hi everybody, if you're watching this video, it's because you're involved in our blended intensive program. You're going to be coming to Fechter. We're going to be showing you our caring professions, our social professions. We're going to be seeing places, listening to practitioners working today, and we're going to be doing some of it ourselves. And one of the highlights of the week will be an art therapy session where I can promise you we're going to get our hands dirty. Quite literally, we're going to get our fingers covered in paint. And although it's a longer session, an afternoon session, there's so much we could tell you about this whole area. It'll be foreign and quite alien to many of you guys, so you'll be working hard to understand what you're doing and what's happening around you. For this reason, I want to produce this video for you to help you contextualize what we're doing, to give you the background to really understand the concept of the afternoon. So this video, a very, very, very brief introduction to families, systems, systemic therapy, and art therapy. So to start here, as a starting point, I guess I ought to draw attention to perspectives in the caring professions in the 20th century. Often in social work, we would think we know with which person a problem lies. We link problems to individuals. For example, in the case of child welfare, we think we're identifying problematic parenting, dangerous parenting maybe. So we see the problem as residing in that one human being, the parent. Or in the context of child guidance clinics, consultations of families, we look at a child and we think we can identify the child's problems, the child's disturbances, so to say. So what I'm giving you really is an idea very big in the 20th century, that our problems could often be understood by looking at individuals. We had an individual-based perspective. And if we did it in social work, maybe we were copying medicine. 20th century medicine, developed so quickly because our understanding of individual pathology, individual disease, that progressed in such an interesting way. So maybe we became fixated by looking at the individual. Today's talk, this video, is about systemic thinking, and it's worth noting that's the obvious alternative to this individual perspective. Now, we can almost break it up. There's actually two ways of doing this. For me, there's two nice alternatives to these individual perspectives. What am I thinking of here? What are these alternatives I have in mind? As far as I'm concerned, we have two interesting alternatives, two interesting possibilities here. We can see the individual as part of a very wide system, the community, the society in which they are a member of. So let's look at the big picture. Let's look at our client interacting with a large group, the largest of groups. This approach gets interesting. If we think about the community and society, we think of the structures within our community and within our society. And actually this perspective leads us in quite a political direction. But there is an alternative. We can also focus on the client as part of a different system, their own family, the direct family system, the family which they're part of. And again, very, very interesting, exciting for us as social professionals, but it takes us in quite a different direction, away from the public and into the realm of the private, the complexity, the intricacies of that private family life. So this family system approach is what I'm talking about in this particular video. So I guess our first step has to be defining this idea of the system. I've used the word a few times in this video already. What is a system? Try to define it. Pause here and put a few words, jot a few words down on your paper. We can look for definitions, and you don't have to look far. The Oxford English Dictionary has a very satisfying definition. Here it is: a set of things working together as parts of a mechanism or an interconnecting network, a complex whole. So we're looking at things as being elements in a larger complex whole or network or mechanism. I'm guessing when I asked you to define system, you thought of systems you knew. Maybe you thought of your country's political system, for example, or your country's education system, capturing and integrating everything from kindergarten through primary school, secondary school, college and university. So we think of systems around. So we think of systems around us, and when I was your age, I studied mathematics. I was always fascinated by maths and physics, and maybe astronomy is the most exciting part of that. So I naturally thought of a solar system. I'm not sure if this picture's a good one or a bad one. You can see these big balls very closely together in space. That's not how it is. Some of these balls are so distant you cannot see them with the naked eye. We're actually tiny little specks in this vast, enormous space. And all of the planets are whizzing around the sun, held together by gravity. Now the sun, this big burning mass, has a lot of gravity pulling us in, but the planets influence each other's orbits as well. Think of Jupiter, this big, enormous planet with the red dot in front of us. If that wasn't there tomorrow, the Earth's orbit would shift slightly. There would be other consequences as well if this system element wasn't there. Because Jupiter's so big, it attracts a lot of asteroids and comets towards it. In other words, a comet that may hit the Earth would end up hitting Jupiter instead. So its presence in space, even if we're not aware of it, it's acting as a kind of protective big brother for us. So these 8 planets that we have in our solar system, these 8 system elements, so to say, they're interacting with each other. Even if they're distant millions of miles away in space, they're having an effect, they're having an impact. And if I've just said 8 planets, of course, you've also got that asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter, maybe a planet that never was. Sometimes these rocks form together into a planet, but that never happened. In a sense, it was a planet that was never born. So I'm already kind of jumping into the thinking of systems that we recognize a little bit in social work as well. We're seeing these elements, in this case using the laws of physics, but we're seeing how interdependent, how complex their interrelations are. So we're entering the realm of systems theory here. And systems theory really is a 20th century science, a mid-20th century science specifically. It had really important roots in the 1930s, and he's boomed and became well known in the 1950s. It was big in the German-speaking world at first. This figure here is an Austrian, and his early ideas were important for the development of systems theory. What's it about? It's about looking at the relations between the system elements. So how are they connected? A little bit like my planets held together by gravity. What are the forces holding our system together? The idea of systems theory is that complex systems can be analysed. Yes, they're complex. Yes, their behaviour is hard to predict, but we can begin to see what's happening within the system. We can begin to understand it. Despite the complexity, there are patterns, there are characteristics of our system. So this is interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary stuff. Think of biology, think of mathematics, think of organisation science, sociology. So many disciplines developed this systems theory in the 20th century. We're interested in the system of the family. So obviously this is the stuff of psychotherapy, the stuff of medicine, the stuff of social work. And quite specifically, systems theory manifested itself in a very clear way in family therapy. And basically family therapy, even if we don't mention it in the name, is systemic family therapy. So family therapy always takes that systems approach. So we're going to be looking now at the family as a system. What kind of things could we look at and think about if we view a family as a system? So what are the consequences of seeing the family as a system? Maybe pause here and jot down some ideas. It's interesting in so many ways. There's so many things that we can look at. We can look at the interrelationships between the system elements, the family members. We can look at their interrelated behaviours, how these behaviours bounce off on one another. And we can look at their mutual influences, which is so complex because actually every element in that family, every person is joined by relationship lines to all the other family members. It's like a network of relationships, a network of influences. We can look at the family beliefs, the family culture. In a sense, I'm talking about the rules here, the rules which shape and bind the system, shape how it works. We can look at the roles within the system. What parts are we playing in this family system? What place does an individual have within that system? We can look at hierarchies. In my family of origin, so my parents' family, so to say, I was the youngest child, the younger brother of my sister. So I have maybe the lowest or certainly most junior status in that hierarchy. Now I'm a dad myself, so I have a different place in that family system. We can look at identifications. Maybe as a male child, I had a particular identification on my father. Maybe that sometimes happens, for example. So that would be an identification with somebody that I know. But I could also have an identification with somebody that I'm not so directly aware of. My middle name, for example, is John, and that's the name of my mother's father. I'm actually named after a grandfather. And my mother's father, he died in the war. He didn't meet my mother other than her as a baby. So that's an interesting idea. Maybe there's an identification between us, even if I never knew that figure. So connections within the family. Patterns of interaction, patterns of behavior. Maybe I'm doing something which other people in my family do as well. An interesting example of this is illness. Maybe my illness behavior, maybe I have some kind of disease that somebody else in my family also had. And this is kind of curious. So when we look at illness within a family system, we don't see it as an individual thing, but rather it belongs to the system, if you like. Okay, so my eating disorder is not actually mine, it's ours. It belongs to the whole of the family. Or mum's depression, it's not her depression, it's actually the family's depression. It comes from the family. And maybe this last point is the one I really would like to focus on. This really is quite new. This thinking pushed medicine forwards, for example. This is a fresh way to see disease or disorders within the family context. So what developed in the course of the second half of the last century was systemic family therapy. Strictly speaking, this is a form of psychotherapy. Yes, it's done sometimes by social workers, but they have to train especially for it. And for me, it's closer to psychotherapy than it is to social work and its principles in how it works. So it's not a social work thing or social pedagogy thing, strictly speaking. It's dealing with issues, behaviours, illnesses, problems from a systems perspective, not from an individual perspective. It's interested in relationships, it's interested in behaviours, and it's interested in how the family functions, the functioning within the family. And it looks at problems there, blockages, limiting factors, the factors that stop us from being properly free. And it tries to support growth and development and change in families. What are its characteristics? How can I pin it down further? Well, it sees problems as belonging to the system. Think of my illness example. That's the system's illness, not one individual's illness. And it looks for opportunities for change and growth. It's quite a future-oriented therapy. And we look at what may be stopping change and growth from happening. Some of the tricks that family therapists have, they're very much into reframing. So helping members see situations differently, trying to facilitate kind of a fresh perspective on the family's life. A big word that comes up in the literature is circular. Now it's circular in terms of how it sees things arising in mutual interaction. There's no linear cause and effect here, but rather a dynamic process which is changing all the time because of this continual interaction. So circularity is one of the key themes, and you can see this in the questioning. It often focuses on relationships as being dynamic, possibly changing all the time. There's always that potential for change. So it's not a static view of the family, but a dynamic one. And that's what we see in our circular questioning. This is maybe one of the most characteristic features of family therapy. Have a look at this. I've made up this question spontaneously. How would your mother find it if your father stopped doing that? I don't know what that is. It doesn't really matter. But the point is, I'm asking my client about what their mother, a third party, would actually think if the other figure, the father, who's also maybe not necessarily here, would change his behaviour. So it's wonderful how my question binds together three separate parties. Okay, so it's what we call a triadic question in this case. And there's also another characteristic of family therapy, hypothetical questions. We invite the people to think, how could it be different? How could it be different? So we often have a kind of hypothetical situation. What would it be like if? So there you are. Systemic therapy, it's quite hard for me to pin it down, but if you see it happening, you recognize it immediately. And these circular questions are a lovely example of what makes it so typical, so characteristic. In our session together, we're going to use some of the toolkit of our systemic family therapy friends. You're invited to produce a genogram or a genosociogram. So maybe it's nice if I say what these things are. So tools which family therapists often use. In a sense, a genogram is just like a family tree. It's really quite simple. It's you and your relations to the other figures in your family, in your extended family. A sociogram, in contrast, that's a diagrammatic representation of a system, and it highlights the connections between the system elements. For example, whether an element has a strong relationship to another element. Now, we can combine the sociogram with the genogram if we want to. These can be brought together, and together we might talk about it as a genosociogram. The idea here is that you have this basic family tree, but you're giving more information. You're giving information about the strength of the relationships. So you can use the thickness of a line, for example, to highlight a strong bind between two figures in that family. Now, a genosociogram, it helps us develop hypotheses. It helps us to understand what's going on and to recognize patterns and connections between family members. And getting it all down on paper diagrammatically can be really, really helpful and really, really illuminating. I can recommend literature. There's a paper on this, which you can find open access, von der Lippe 2015. Now, why am I talking about this in this video? As I mentioned right at the beginning, we're going to have an art therapy session together. And our own art therapist, she uses systemic approaches, and she's invited you all to do her a genosociogram of your family. So that's why I'm giving you this background in systemic thinking. There's so much theory here. I don't want to overwhelm you when the session actually starts. As I said, we're going to be spending our time getting our hands dirty. So this is why I'm giving you this theoretical background beforehand. I guess a closing question I have to ask in this video is, what is art therapy? It's not going to be a theme of our whole week. It's only going to be one afternoon in our week. But what is art therapy exactly? How would you define it? You know, what's it actually about? And is it the same as social pedagogy using creative media? Because you've watched my other video about social pedagogy, which also uses the arts as well. You know, is it the same approach? Maybe pause here and think about those questions together. What can we say about art therapy? Well, it's done by different professionals. It's worth noting an art therapist is a protected title. They need to have postgraduate certificates. They need to have experience. So it's actually quite hard to get this status. It's a long and thorough training program. The person becoming an art therapist can come from all kinds of different backgrounds, but typically they're interested in art and they're interested in psychotherapy too. What are they doing? They're using art and creative expression to improve well-being or address mental health problems or personal problems. So the client wants to have some change in their life, maybe because of a disorder or an illness or some kind of personal problems or issues. Art therapists are not a homogeneous bunch. Each one of them will have a different therapy concept, a different therapy background. So you could have, for example, a psychoanalytical art therapist, but you could also have a behaviourist art therapist, and their work really would be quite distinct, quite different from one another. Going back to a question asked a few moments ago, is art therapy social pedagogy? Not at all. Not at all. Yes, there's some overlap, but effectively these are quite different approaches to using art, to using creativity in working with clients. I cannot stress this enough, art therapy is different from social pedagogy using creative methods. It usually works with people who experience distress, trauma, or disorder. Social pedagogy using creative methods can work with everyday teenagers or older people without any kind of disorder or problem being in the foreground. Therapy tends to have some kind of issue which is helping the client to resolve. There's different aims, different techniques. Typically art therapy has a smaller group size if it's a group activity, and it may even be done one-to-one, which is less common for social pedagogy, of course. Art therapy and social pedagogy may feel different from one another, and this is a point to hold on to. In our week together, you'll be experiencing creative social pedagogy, for example, with music. Notice how it feels different from our art therapy session together. And it's worth me stressing this, art therapy is often highly focused in terms of rules and therapeutic objectives. In other words, a social pedagogue may even say to a bunch of young people, we're going to have some fun doing some painting together, doing some drawing together. And art therapists may be a little bit more strict in terms of what and how we do, because they have a much more focused therapeutic objective in mind when they're guiding that work. So I can't stress this enough. Two totally different perspectives, doing both in the course of our week together gives you a lovely chance, of course, to contrast them and spot the differences and the similarities. Hey, this brings me to the end of this presentation. Here's the literature. Hope you enjoyed the video, and looking forward to really getting some hands-on experience with you in this area in our week together in Fechter. See you soon, guys.